record. And here we go, 2, 3, 4. Right, yes, I think people are coming through now. Good morning, everyone. As usual, I'm Steve Smedley, Acuity Associate. Welcome to our 4th spring webinar that aims to kind of address key topical issues to help you basically navigate the extremely complex strategic and operational challenges that you currently face. I'd also like to welcome James Presswich, who's Director of Policy and External Affairs at CIH. Welcome him back, in fact, and this time he'll be taking a look at the role of professionalism as a means of ensuring the highest standards of service delivery, whilst also hopefully helping to secure the sector's reputation, which has taken a bit of a battering of late. Before I hand over to James, just a couple of housekeeping issues. This webinar is scheduled to last for an hour. If it doesn't last that long, that's fine. James will be taking questions at logical pauses in his talk. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to post very succinct and to the point questions, which I'll sift through, and I'll pose them to James verbally. We are recording this, so you will be able to find it on our website shortly after we finish, but you'll also be able to direct your colleagues to it. Without further ado, over to you, James.
Steve, thank you. Thank you very much. It's really, really nice to be here to talk to you all. I was glad Steve said that we don't have to fill the hour, because I haven't got a lengthy presentation. I didn't want to bore you with a whole series of slides. I've just really noted a whole series of what I think are quite key points that relate to the professionalism agenda, for sure, but also relate to the issues that we're facing around social housing, quality of social housing, and some of the criticism that the sector is facing at the moment. So hopefully that will strike a chord. Those kind of twin, although interlinked themes, will strike a chord with you all, and I really hope will prompt some questions and some debate. Otherwise, it might be quite a short session if you're just here to listen to me. I want to get, if I'm going to be cheeky, I want to get something from this as well today too. And I think that is to start or to continue the debate on these twin challenges of professionalism and quality of social housing. So, I mean, let's start at the beginning, I guess, and I suppose this is a little bit of a organisational mea culpa on behalf of CIH. So I joined CIH as a member. I got my membership in, I think, 2005 as part of a social housing masters that I did. And actually, I remember the key thing for me wasn't the degree element of that. It was getting membership of CIH. That was a huge thing for me at the time, as someone who was still relatively young at that point, very young actually at that point. And we just started on my housing career, my journey to housing. I was a housing officer, team leader, those kind of roles, very frontline roles. And for me at that time, I was ambitious, as we all are when we're in our early mid-20s, and I wanted to get on, and all the job adverts that I would look at for those jobs that were at levels above generally would say membership of a professional body, membership of Chartered Institute of Housing as a requirement. Often, occasionally, it would be wouldn't be an essential requirement, but very often when you would look at job spec, it would be an essential requirement that you have membership of Chartered Institute.
Excuse me, James. Just a second. Yeah, I think some of yours, the sound quality isn't that brilliant. Right. I don't know if you need to be a bit closer to your mic.
Okay.
Oh, that sounds all right.
Does that sound all right?
That sounds way better. Your face is way bigger in the screen, slightly scary, but it's worth it. It's worth it for the sound. Yeah.
Well, I've got quite a long face, so maybe we should use widescreen, which would have...
I'll stick it on portrait. Yeah. No, that's way better. Thank you.
Okay, good. I'm glad you. So hopefully you've heard most of what I've said. I've got this terrible habit when I'm talking of looking off to one side, like a Premier League football manager when he's being interviewed in the tunnel after a game, never looking directly at the camera. So I'll try and endeavour to do that. So just to recap, in case you didn't hear it, years ago, started my career, membership of CIH was absolutely essential if you wanted to kick on. And at some point over the last 15, 20 years or so, that membership of a professional body in the housing sector became less important. I mean, I haven't looked for a new job for a while, but I would imagine that you won't find membership of CIH as an essential requirement on too many job specs currently. That's a shame. I think at CIH we have to shoulder quite a lot of the responsibility for that. I think there were times over the last 15, 20 years or so where we maybe lost our focus on what it means to be a professional body, and that is something that was really very, very different to what it means to be a trade body. As the kind of guardian custodian of the housing profession. I also think, and I feel qualified to say this because I worked for housing associations for years. I think to a degree, some, not all, but some housing associations and local authorities as well moved away from that focus on housing as a profession, and moved more towards housing as being something that fitted into the kind of generic customer service space. And while it was, whilst you would be foolish not to look to learn from other sectors to do things better, I do sometimes think that the very unique, I would say, status of the social housing sector was lost a little bit. And I think that was probably a bad thing for us as housing professionals. I think it was a bad thing for the people that live in our homes as well, particularly when it comes to stigmatisation. We know we work in a sector where the people who live in our homes are very often unfairly stigmatised by the media, by politicians, and very sadly sometimes also by some of us who work in the sector. And I'm sure we all have horror stories from our times on the front line of hearing people say things that maybe we didn't challenge at the time, but probably didn't sit very comfortably with us, and probably make us even more uncomfortable now. So, through that lens, I think we need to take kind of collective responsibility as a sector and as a professional body for that move away from the principles of what it means to be a profession, to be really proud of. And I think fundamentally, so I don't want this to be a negative talk today. I think fundamentally, social housing is a sector and a profession of which we should be proud, because there is a heck of a lot that you do that is fantastic, and people's lives are better as a result of that. And we shouldn't forget that throughout this today. I suppose, people often rewrite history, don't they, to suit their agendas. And it's often difficult when you look back to pinpoint a moment where we kind of went from one place to another. But I suppose what the appalling tragedy at Grenfell did was it crystallised, I think, for many, the breakdown in the relationship, the professional relationship between some who work in the sector and some who live in social housing. So there were clear, and remain clear, structural issues around building safety, around the regulatory system that were responsible for the tragedy at Grenfell. but in the inquiry that came out of that, in this social housing green paper, and then latterly the social housing white paper, I think there was some legitimate criticism of the sector at large about the way in which we engage with and involve people who live in our homes in the decision-making process, and about transparency as well, really. And I think it's important to point out that that's not necessarily criticism of people who work on the very front line. I'm on the board of a small housing association, and I think that would be a legitimate criticism of those of us who run organisations as well. That link to the people who live in our homes, for some organisations, was probably lost. And I know there's been a lot of soul searching over the last 4 or 5 years from all of us in the sector, and particularly those of us who are on boards and responsible for running organisations, to say, well, how do we reconnect with the people who live in our homes? For the organisation. So one of the things that we did at CIH, that we've started to do a couple of years ago, and that we launched, it was our professional standards. So our professional standards, and very happy to send details of these out after the sessions. Hopefully most of you are now familiar with the professional standards, but what these are a set of behaviours, set of attitudes that we think should personify a housing professional. So we launched these, I think about 12, 15 months ago or so ago now. And a lot of organisations have already started to take the professional standards and to embed them across their organisation. And the aim for me of the professional standards is very much around the cultural piece. And it is for CIH, I think, a reconnection with our core purpose, which is to be the best professional body that we can be. I think it's a legitimate criticism to say, well, hang on, CIH, if you're the professional body, why didn't you have these professional standards 10, 15 years ago? Sorry, Steve, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, sorry, you just froze out.
Oh, sorry.
It's only happened twice, and it kind of only happens for a couple of 3 seconds. So if you could just repeat that last sentence.
Yes, yeah, I was just going to say that it would be a legitimate criticism of CIH that we probably should have these professional standards earlier. But the important thing is that they are there now, and I think form a really important part of what the sector response should be to the criticism around culture, and around transparency, and around accountability to our tenants. So I think that the key thing for me around the professional standards is that applicability shouldn't be ring-fenced purely for people who work on the front line. This absolutely isn't about kind of skills that people need to do specific jobs. There's training on the job and training courses to help people do that. This is about attitudes and behaviours. This is about the fundamentals that should underpin any organisation with a social purpose. And they are equally as applicable whether you're on the board of a housing association, whether you're the director of a local authority housing department, or whether you're a housing administrator. And I actually think there's a really important point here as well about they should be applicable not just to people who work directly for you, but actually could form a really important part of the procurement and the tendering process for external contracts if you use them. So if we are sending people into our homes, the homes that we manage, to deal with issues in people's homes, and by extension to deal with people, we need to make sure that they are living and breathing the behaviours that we would expect from a housing professional. And that's the same if you're going into a property to cap off the gas, or if you're the chief executive of a housing association. There's some really important work that we've done there. We at CIH, we're involved with the government's review of professionalisation across the sector, which most of you, I'm sure, will know came off the back of the social housing white paper. Now, I'm not able to talk about the work of the government's review on professionalisation, but what I can say is that I get a very real sense that this is absolutely a key priority for the new Secretary of State and for government. I think it's a legitimate criticism to say to the government it was too slow to kickstart some of the recommendations that came out of the Social Housing White Paper. And the review of professionalisation was one of those things that I think probably took too long to start. But I think, as I say, with this Secretary of State, to give them some credit, seems to have given this some impetus. And I would expect that government review to make its report, its recommendations at some point over the next 2 or 3 months, which I think is a positive. I'm not going to try and preempt what that review might say, but what I would always suggest is that the sector should be proactive and not wait for the recommendations that come from that. And in the conversations that I have with people across the local authority and the housing association sector, I know many of you are already thinking long and hard about how you embrace greater professionalism in the sort of housing professional sense, and use that to drive the kind of culture change that I think we probably all think we need to embark upon within the sector. And again, that is not to underplay some of the work that already goes on across the sector. The majority, in fact, of housing organisations, of social landlords, do this very well. We've done it for years. We're very good at it. But we know there are outliers, either at the individual level or at the organisational level, where we need to do more. And that, I think, brings us on then to the current debate that the sector finds itself in the midst of, which is around the quality of our homes. And I think this speaks very much to, or gets to the heart of, really, the professionalism work, the culture change work that we and others across the sector are embarking upon. I feel like every time I talk about this issue, I have to say this, but you know, when we saw some of the reports on ITN, some of the properties that people were living in, it disappointed hugely. It was pretty upsetting, I think, for all of us that care about the sector. But what it did, probably importantly, was I think it crystallised the view that we need to do more on the quality of stock, but also on the kind of culture that could allow some of those incidents that we've seen to happen, to take place. And as always, I feel that I need to say, you know, it's easy for me. I'm not in frontline housing anymore. It's easy for me to sit on the sideline and say, well, this shouldn't happen and you should do better. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's really hard. You know, and these are quite difficult conversations to have, certainly with the media, certainly with government. But I think it's important to point out that you know, over the course of the last few years, we had a rent cut that took significant capacity out of the sector. Organisations looked to respond to that cut, often by looking to deliver savings in planned maintenance programmes. Probably was a mistake in hindsight, but I absolutely understand why those kind of decisions had to be taken in the context of that rent cut. And then organisations have huge numbers of competing priorities. So we had a coalition government in 2010 and the Cameron-Osborne government in 2015, who were very, very clear, I think, that the purpose of social housing providers was to build homes, almost at the cost of anything else. Many of us did that. Again, it's a core part of the sector's mission is to deliver new homes. But I do sometimes wonder whether the balance was lost and the focus was too heavily on supply at the expense of existing stock. So partly driven by the government's attitude towards the sector. But I do wonder whether some of us, and you know, I worked at the National Housing Federation at that time, so I include myself in this. I wonder whether some of us needed to be braver at that point in challenging some of those assumptions that government made. And then we have the whole range of competing investment priorities around building safety and the race to net zero. So this is hard, and I appreciate that. What I would say is I think that the absolute core purpose of any social landlord is to make sure that its homes are, number one, safe, I think that will always be number one on the list. But then number two, decent, and I don't use that word in the decent home sense. I mean that in terms of I guess what I would call the sniff test, really, which is, would I be happy to live in this home? Would I be happy for someone I love and care about to live in this home? Am I embarrassed if I see the state of a home that I or the organisation I work for is responsible for? So there are measures around decency and non-decency, but I think this goes somewhere beyond that. And there is the structural issue, isn't there? And I think this is where, as a sector, we need to act together across housing associations and local authorities to say, well, what is the extent of the issue, the quality issue? How many homes do we have in our individual organisations that we are uncomfortable about, that we're embarrassed about, that we wouldn't want to live in ourselves? I think that feels like a good, strong starting point. And secondly, there needs to be a plan then to put those properties right. You know, for housing associations, I think there's a clear role there for boards. So, you know, as I said, I'm on the board of a housing association. So what line of sight am I going to have that those properties that we think fall below the standard that we aspire to? What's the plan to get those quickly, to prioritise them and to get them quickly up to a standard that we're not embarrassed about and that we're happy for someone to live in? So that's the structural issue. And then there's the cultural piece as well, which is there are people living in those homes. We can't just move them out. We're in the midst of a housing crisis. You know, we can't necessarily demolish homes that aren't in great condition. We can't necessarily move people out because we haven't necessarily got anywhere to put those people. So what do we do? And this is the cultural piece. This is the professionalism piece. What do we do in terms of working with the people who do live in those homes that we're not happy with? Presumably they won't be happy with. To work with them while we get those homes up to the sort of standard that we can be proud of. And I think it's, you know, so I think the first bit of that work, what's the scale here? I think the scale probably, you know, my sense is will probably be quite small. But what we have to think about, and again, this is the cultural piece, is, well, for every one of those homes, there is a person or people living in them. And that, you know, that can't be right. We need to make sure that those homes are fit for people to live in. So hopefully that links in the two things that I'm talking about around professionalism, but particularly how it links to the culture change piece as well, and how it links to the issues around quality. For me, and I make this point regularly at board meetings, quality of existing stock. I think safety and quality of existing stock is priority number one. It probably always should have been, but I think for too long, too many of us probably took our eyes off the ball on that. I don't think that's happening now. I think organisations almost universally are saying, yeah, it needs to be priority number one, but we need to catch up, and we're going to have to accept the criticism that comes our way while we work through that. So I think that's it, Steve. I ended up rattling on for a little bit longer than I'd intended, but hopefully that's prompted some questions and some thoughts from people.
No, thanks for that, James. Yes, I'd encourage people to just, if they can initially, post their questions using the Q&A function. But I think since there's relatively few of us on this, there's only about 12 of us on this. What I'm going to do is, when you post your question, I'm going to invite you to talk if you're quite happy to do it. So we've got a question from Andrew Watson. Yeah. I'm going to be clicking the allowed to talk button, Andrew, so you can actually have a chat with James. So here we go. Right, Andrew, that's it. You should be free to talk now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, James.
Hi.
I'm actually retired. I'm a chartered surveyor, but I'm still active, but not in an employed sense. And also a member of the Association Project Safety. And I was sort of drawn in, I suppose you could say, into the Grenfell because the RICS set up a group on the back of their president being put onto the panel of experts in 2017. So we were quite heavily involved both with the CIC and Dame Judith Hackett's report, Building Safer Futures. And I noticed recently that she's been giving interviews where she quite clearly has a very individual view about the situation. So in general terms, we've had a challenge, which I think you alluded to, from the Cameron government, coalition government, about deregulation. In my context, when I was working professionally, the Association of Project Safety, particularly, which leads on CDM, were very concerned because there seemed to be a general attitude to try and do away with these regulations. At the time, they couldn't, because the European Union directive required such legislation. But when we actually did meet regarding the review of building regulations, we recognised that the CDM regulations were there and should actually be ones effective to stop what was really the catalogue of disasters that led to Grenfell. And one of the themes which has come out recently in the documentation is the golden thread. So presently, it's not very good, both in terms of the professions, but also in terms of organisations, because they have not been used to working in a collaborative, integrated way for quite a long time. I would say since the 1980s, when we first had quite a major privatisation. And from a professional point of view, the idea of having assessment of professional competence, which means that when you're working, you're able to develop professionally and you can have a career development employment scheme for young people, which is what I used to have when I was working in local authorities, was very much an integral part of the scheme. But now it's not even clear which profession you need to go to for which area of expertise. And they've been struggling very hard to try and come up with a satisfactory means of competency.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things in there for me, Andrew, and I'm not necessarily across the detail of the building safety agenda. We've got people within CIH who specialise in that area for very obvious reasons, but I can certainly talk about the regulatory, in its general sense, the regulatory environment, and the role that I think that has played in the social housing sector in particular. So again, I'm not making a political point, but I think you can trace a lot of this back to the coalition government in 2010. The deregulation, deregulation, cutting of red tape started pretty much from day one, and we saw that in the social housing sector most visibly with the abolition of the TSA. And we moved we repurposed the regulator, now the regulator of social housing, to focus on governance and viability. And I think they've done a great job. I think we've got a really good regulator in the social housing sector, but they're really good at what they've been explicitly asked to regulate by government, which is viability and governance. I think generally speaking, the housing association sector is very investable. It's well governed, and its reputation is quite strong. But of course, what was completely missing was any real focus on consumer regulation, which felt like a mistake at the time, and with hindsight, feels even more of a mistake. We have the serious detriment test, but the bar was clearly set too high. Generally, the serious detriment test only ever seemed to get breached if there was a genuine risk of life. So failures in service standards that didn't meet that very high bar largely went unresolved. And I think it would be fair to say then that the focus of organisations was on meeting the regulatory requirements, and that we probably took our eyes off the ball as far as the consumer standard side of things were concerned. We've got some way towards looking to redress that balance. The National Housing Federation produced together with tenants, which I think was a really good framework for how you look to engage and involve residents and provide greater transparency and accountability to them. I think our professional standards speak very much to the cultural side of that, tackling stigma part of that. And for housing associations, at least, there's the Fed's code of governance too. So I think those three things form a really solid basis for how we look to better represent, engage with, and be accountable towards our tenants and our residents. So some changes there through the changes to consumer regulation, the legislation. It's moving forward, and we will have a new regulatory regime. So I think there's some positives there, albeit it feels like 2022 feels like we've had a lost 10 years, really, doesn't it, as far as engaging our residents is concerned? And we've got a lot of work to do to make up for that.
Yes, and the collaboration between professional bodies, I think, is the thing also that's been lost. And generally with the public sector, and this is where we go back to Margaret Thatcher, where the housing association is seen as private sector. So she is privatising by removing from the public sector the local authorities. I think in practice you wouldn't really see housing associations at that time as private in any sense of the word. It was a bit of a semantics. But the consequence of that removal has meant that the collaboration, in the original collaborations that there were between local authorities, between all bodies, in terms of dealing with getting standards right, has been lost. And from what I see now, there's very little collaboration, even about the immediate issues of the fire safety bill. So, we talk to each other, but we're not actually working together. We're not actually producing a common set of values. And really, the lead could very much be with the housing sector. And the interesting thing with the National Housing Federation is that it is a representative body which interfaces with the authorities, I suppose you'd say. So, the government is interfacing very directly with the National Housing Federation. And something like that is needed to get this cooperation, which is so necessary to get these things right.
Right, thank you, Andrew. Again, I'll just remind people that we can, to pose your questions using the Q&A function. I'd just like to pick up on a couple of things if I can, James, just whilst we're waiting for questions to come through. My personal, certainly a number of the listeners who know me will kind of know that I kind of bang on about, you can't help but kind of trip into politics, because so much of this is about policy and it's about ideology and stuff. So I completely I think the culture of social housing has taken a battering, and I think it was really interesting what you said about it being a profession in its own right, and it seems to have almost been usurped by generic customer service, because everyone bangs on about the private sector, the commercial sector, as if they're kind of the next best thing to the baby Jesus. And these organisations are inherently better than the third sector or the public sector at this stuff. And so we take that kind of generic customer service at the same time as the sector was deregulated. And I completely agree with you. We've gone back at least 10 years. I mean, the CIH was doing some brilliant things around tenant-led self-regulation. I mean, that's over 10 years ago. It was cutting edge stuff, and it all kind of got binned with shaps and pickles. So we have the deregulation, we have the political message is that the social housing sector is only good for one thing, and that's actually building homes for home ownership. So I think all of these things have little kind of cultural, they change people's behavior through the organisation and start to make a cultural change slowly by slowly. I'm just wondering if you feel that that along with things like generic customer service, that the aggregation of the sector, the consolidation of the sector with what looks suspiciously like the old municipal monoliths of the 70s and 80s, have we got too enamored of having mega housing associations where we've attracted lots of out-of-sector staff? Because again, all of these out-of-sector staff have got all these skills that we just lack. Are these all factors that have drifted our culture away from where it should be?
Gosh, there's a lot in that, Steve. I think we could talk all day about this, couldn't we? We might need the whole hour. Yeah, I'm not. So I will come out in defence of big guys that think a little bit here, and say I've not necessarily seen evidence that smaller is more beautiful. So I think this you will see good and bad practice across the sector, and I think fundamentally it's more a question of the culture that exists within those organisations. Maybe it's legitimate to say it's harder to embed a culture in a large organisation than it is with a smaller one, but I think this comes down to the question that those of us that are responsible for running organisations need to ask ourselves, which is, are we comfortable to just sit back and say, well, it's not us, it's them? And are we 100% confident that all of the homes in our stock, whether we're a 90,000 home landlord or whether we're a 250 home landlord, are we confident enough to know that the homes that we own and manage don't have any horror stories? I'm not sure we do. I mean, there's a big question here about data as well. I think, the data and the information that we have on our homes. I would imagine larger, better resourced organisations possibly have better data on their homes than smaller organisations. But of course, you need the cultures to run alongside that, don't you? You can have all of the data and all of the metrics to tell you what's going on in your homes or with the condition of your homes. But if you haven't got the culture that empowers people to do something about it, if there are problems, then you're in trouble, I think. And that that comes from the top down. So you're right. There have been lots of people that have come into sector to take over what are, let's be honest, hideously complex organisations, with in some cases hundreds of millions of pounds, possibly even billions of pounds of debt, and investors that need to be to have confidence in that organisation and in the running of that organisation. But what I would say is if someone is going to come in to work in this sector, they need to, and I think the good ones have done this, acknowledge that it is a unique sector, that it is different, and embrace that. I wonder sometimes whether we've been too shy in talking about the unique nature of the sector. Everyone says they're unique, don't they? I'm sure you can go speak to somebody who works for an energy provider and say, well, we're utterly unique. But housing providers, social housing providers are we are dealing with people. This is people's lives. When people live in our homes, that's different to working at John Lewis or working at Tesco. It just is. And whilst there will be some crossover, and for some of the skills that you have when you work in retail, for example, there will definitely be some crossover skills. It's very different because we're talking about a scarce resource. We're talking about often some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And we're talking about a lack of choice for the consumer. Let's use that phrase, for the consumer, a lack of choice. So all of those things, plus the social purpose of the sector, I think does make it absolutely unique. And this, I think, gets to the heart of something that I've talked about quite a lot, which is if you sit in a room with chief execs and directors of local authority housing departments, they will often talk about the sense of social purpose, that is one of the main drivers for them to get out of bed every morning. That's why they work in this sector. That's brilliant. But I've also worked at organisations where there might be one of the biggest employers in that particular town. And actually someone's driver for going to work for that housing association or to work for that council is because it's local, terms and conditions are good, they're a good employer, it's flexible. Those are all perfectly acceptable reasons to want to go and work for an organisation. But what has to come with that, the contract, the deal is, well, if you come and work here, this is an organisation with a social purpose, and you must buy into that when you come here. And that's why I think, we should be incredibly hard at looking to tackle stigma from within the sector. We've seen it, I'm sure, all of us over the years. Some of us, the brave ones, I probably didn't when I was younger, but the brave ones will have challenged that. But we see too much of that going on, and we need to get our house in order as well, and tackle that in particular. And again, I think that gets to the heart of what it means to be a professional in this sector, really.
Yeah, thanks. Right. Again, any questions, do feel free to post them in the Q&A. I'll just come back briefly on something. I think, everything is pointing to me. It was something that I remember I looked at when I was doing my postgrad in housing and social policy. This is about culture management ultimately, and I don't think you should beat yourself up as the CIH too much for not having a bunch of professional kind of standards out there. I think that'd be dead handy, and it plays to the notion of the uniqueness of social housing, that we have our own set of professional standards that can't be kind of dumbed down by platitudinous customer service mantras and stuff like that. So I think that would be dead useful. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a bunch of organizations for social purpose whose entire delivery of mission is dependent upon people buying into the values and the mission that you're talking about, and, if you like, walking the talk. So I guess what I'm thinking is that if we all want to do a better job, I think organizations, along with everything else that they're having to try and face, need to get better at managing their culture and understanding what that actually means, how they can change culture through borrowing from from Andrew's term, a golden thread that goes right from a sense of purpose and mission right the way through to how people behave in their day-to-day job.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that probably should come from the top. So I think there's a couple of ways, and there's a couple of ways of looking at it, isn't there? Around this, which is, we need to concentrate absolutely on frontline, directly customer-facing roles. And we do, but I think the leadership and the culture must come from the top. So, one of the things I'm very keen for is for board members in particular to assess themselves against our professional standards, see where they think the gaps are, and use that to inform their CPD, their training and their development. Same with executive teams as well. I wonder how much someone who sits in the finance team looking after the HRA account or in the finance team of a housing association, I wonder how much they are connected to that sense of social purpose. They may not, through no fault of their own, they may not ever meet a person who lives in one of their homes that organisation manages, but they still need to understand what it means to work for an organisation and in a sector that has that sense of social purpose, and that's why the professional standards aren't focused on specific job roles, because it has to be broader than that. I would say if you're the head of finance at a housing association, for example, you should see where you are against the professional standards, and whether you live and breathe the ethos of the organisation you work for. And if you don't, well, I'm sure there's a head of finance job for a car manufacturing parts company down the road, and you can go and do that.
Brilliant, thanks, James. Right, there's no more questions. So I think we should probably call it a day. All I'll say is, for me, this has been one of the more fascinating ones of these webinars that I've done, because I've spent 32 years in the sector. It's where I ended up settling fairly early on. And it's quite probably exactly the same as what you said. It's really important to me. There's so many detractors of the sector that we need to kind of make it like a redoubtable almost. And I think some of the topics that you've covered go right to the heart of why we exist and why our organisations exist. And I think you've got some great ideas of a way out. I think we'd be dead keen to get a copy of the professional standards, and
Yes.
we'll stick them on our website so that people can find them.
I will do that.
And I guess the thing is watch this space for more pronouncements from the CIH on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you for letting me come along and talk to you about it today. I would happily talk about this subject for hours, because I think it absolutely gets to the heart of all the issues that face the sector. And if we can get the culture piece right, then I think everything flows from that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, James. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
Thanks everybody else for attending. Recording will be available shortly, and hopefully see you at a future one of these. Cheers, James.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.